Astro Aura, the future is here.
Peace, and welcome to the first episode of the R.E.A.L series. I'm Hekaimaak, husband, father, and priest of the Rasa tradition of ancient Kemet. And on today's episode, we'll be getting into the R.E.A.L Ausar, or the R.E.A.L Wuser. Before we start getting into the details of the R.E.A.L Wuser, it's very important to understand how his role and his interpretation has been presented in modern spirituality has been corrupted. Wuser, in a Kemetic-African perspective, represents peace, order, and justice. But it's also very important to see that the way that we perceive peace, the way that we perceive order, is different from what you find in the Indo-European and European traditions, which are governing and dictating what the definitions of peace are, and have also dictated for the better part of 100 years how we should perceive Wuser. Wuser's peace is not this passive, detached state. It is an active, relational, dynamic balance that is in harmony with Ma'at, that has a boundary and a role to fulfill in the order of Ma'al or Ma'at. Also, his characteristics of resurrection, renewal, emphasizes that peace must come as an action, not an inaction or detachment, but as an action to restore harmony and order, even if that means that we must confront destruction in chaos. Balance must be restored for harmony, for Ma'at to exist. We'll get into the actual Kemetic-African perspective of Wuser, the R.E.A.L Wuser, and then we'll talk about the Indo-European perspective. But before we do that, it's very, very important to understand the fundamental differences in worldview between the Kemetic-African perspective or the Black Ancestral perspective and the Indo-European perspective, as these fundamental worldviews are operating under the surface in everything that we do. This thinking is based on what I call the linear vertical integrated model that we see prevalent in all of the things Europe has produced, right? Versus the cyclical horizontal holistic models you see African and indigenous societies produce. This linear vertical model is based upon the Eurocentric need, or the European psychological need, to dominate and control. So therefore the hierarchies are always top down, they're always rigid, they're always hard. And this interpretation goes into religion, and it goes into spirituality, and what is the perception of Wuser, what is the perception of his role, and the perception of his position versus what African Black ancestral traditions say about it. So for the Indo-European and European models, progress is linear. It moves in a straight line. And history is seen as a straight line, right? You have the beginning, which is creation, or what is termed civilization. Then you have your endpoint, which is apocalypse, salvation, the great judgment, or in some cases a utopia, as modern spirituality changes what the three Abrahamic faiths say from apocalypse and destruction, and they describe it more as a utopia. And that's where you get these ideas of the age of Aquarius being this utopia. And this model encourages this perpetual development, which is out of harmony with what actually happens in life. You'll see that in the stock market, they make all these predictions for what their expectations of growth. And when the companies do not meet those expectations, they deem it as a failure. But if you look at the history of what they're expecting and the growth they're expecting, it's always expected to go like this. Just to go up, 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 up. That's not how nature works. I mean, the sun goes up and the sun goes down every day. Right? The seasons, there's 4 seasons. Even if you don't have a hard experience of the 4 seasons, you still have some cyclical variation. That is life. That is how energy works. So right off the bat, we're already seeing that the Indo-European perspective on life, the Indo-European perspective of religion, is already having an opposition to what is actually experienced on Earth. And what this will do eventually is create a conflict, the opposition with what's going on, and eventually lead to what psychology would deem as cognitive dissonance, or start having delusions, where you're now not dealing with reality as it is, but these ideas, these abstractions of reality. And for modern spirituality, what you will see in terms of the approach to spirituality is these very abstractions. Abstractions is necessary for the human brain for us to organize things, but there's a point where abstractions become you not experiencing the thing anymore. Now it's just a model, or what Carl Jung called archetypes. And so this linear vertical integration model encourages the domination of people. It's this top-down perspective. God comes down. The tree of life, it comes down. And so this top-down approach is used to justify, right, the enslavement of African people and other people. These are savages on the bottom. These are inferior people. We must control them. We must dominate them. In fact, we're justified to do so because we are at the top, the straight line. And as was said, even before Europe became what we know as Europe now, even in the perspective of just the, let's just say, Caucasian approach to life and spirituality, in Greece and Rome, it was the same top-down approach. It's one of the reasons why European men don't respect women, because they don't have this idea of balance, of wholeness, of a horizontal integration that you see in indigenous and African societies. This top-down encourages what? For them to be on top of the woman, to them to be dominating the woman. And that's why feminism and some of what some people will call the benefits of it, ultimately, it's just the switching of the places where now women are dominating top-down approach on men. That is the Caucasian, that is the Indo-European, that is the European experience and approach to life. And then the major fundamental undercurrent of that linear oppositional or linear vertically integrated model is individuality versus the wholeness of community, right? So when Wuser or Ausar is superimposed on Kether at the top of the tree of life, you're now taking Kether, a abstract principle that is detachment, that has to do with a dissolution, a disengagement from reality, versus the actual African approach to Wuser, to Ausar, that deals with a relational and interconnected and interdependence with reality and on reality that we see consistent in all of the other African traditions. What are the major features of a Black ancestral African cyclical horizontal worldview, right? Because horizontal models mean that there's balance, there's male and female, and in the creation stories and the cosmologies of Kemet and the cosmologies of many of the African traditions, you see this same balance of male and female. That's the way that we view life. So there's death, rebirth, renewal, there's chaos, there's destruction. It's a part of life. And these are, and when we say that it's relational, it's practical. There's going to be a tsunami. There's going to be an earthquake. There might be a famine. There's going to be some level of chaos and destruction that is going to occur in life. You cannot avoid it. What is best is, how do we purify? How do we engage? How do we invoke our ancestors? How do we invoke the Interu to be able to live more properly in harmony with that? And that's what you see across all Black ancestral traditions. Wherever we go in the world, that's what you see in all indigenous traditions, wherever we go in the world. Where humans, nature, and the divine coexist in a web of relationships. No being exists in isolation. Empowered is distributed across the whole network, right? Ancestor spirits and Interu deities are active participants in this relational cosmology, working alongside, working with us, working with human beings, rather than just this rulership over us. And of course, they do have a rulership over us, but it's not this top-down hierarchy. Do what I say. This kind of tyrannical or imprisoned perspective of reality, which we know is very much heavy in the yogic text, in the Christian text. This idea of this prison. Also, in an African cyclical horizontal worldview, you see a sharing of power. In the Eurocentric context, the King of England is the king, and that's it. He might have advisors, but that's it. From a Kemetic-African perspective, the king is the king, but he has the Queen Mother. He has advisors. He has the priests that inform him. There is a whole sharing. There are the elders, and they have a say-so in what goes on. The king ultimately has the final decision, but there's a say-so. There's not just this singular head that's just controlling and moving and everything. And we can look at even European history of, King James, right, the author of the Bible, that the most popular version of the Bible. We can look at other kings in other parts of Europe and see how that worked out. And there's even cases where there are Black leaders, African leaders, where this top-down hierarchical approach has not worked out either. And it's not to just demonize, their worldview, but it's to talk about the problems also that is created and to talk about the fundamental differences, because it is very important to understand that this is the foundation of how the Kemetic or all African deities, all indigenous deities are perceived, because these writers on the subjects of spirituality, on the subjects of the deities, are predominantly European. Egyptologists are European. Therefore, everything I just said about their perspective is an undercurrent in how they're perceiving Wuser, how they're perceiving Aset, how they're perceiving Heru. And then you and I take it as reality and say, oh, this must have been what I am. And we have other people who have black skin who then repurpose, repackage, regurgitate what the Egyptologists say or what the Western Esoteric traditions have said. And then you take it and think that, wow, this must be how the real Ausar is. We'll show the differences today. All right, so let's move on to restoring the authentic Wuser, the authentic Ausar. But first, before we go there, we must talk about this popular notion in today's spirituality of peace. While modern spirituality will say that peace is something that is about detachment, it ultimately is an action. It's you not doing anything, but making sure that your inside is calm, even while the world around you crumbles. They call this transcendence. From a Black ancestral perspective, peace without action is incomplete and ultimately unjust. Inner peace is valuable, but it must coexist with external harmony. A person who neglects to address injustice in their own community cannot claim to embody true peace, right? And this is where I said that psychology will view a lot of these ideas as cognitive dissonances, as delusions. There's nothing wrong with wanting to maintain a calm to approach a situation, but when you do not remove the problem or deal with the problem as it is, all you're doing is perpetuating a delusion. Though you may be peaceful and calm, on the inside, the perpetrator is still there. The crime is still being committed. And that's why we see the reign of modern spirituality. Things have not improved for Black people or people in the African diaspora. Not real stuff, right? Our finances, our families, our health, it has not improved while we are being at peace and being one with other people, right? So the Black ancestral perspective, the African cultural perspective on peace is a dynamic and relational process rather than just being an absence of conflict. Ancestors and Interu are often invoked to maintain or restore peace, while modern spirituality talks about peace as some kind of a connection with you and God. No ancestors involved. Every indigenous person, every African person, we're talking about 80 to 90% of the planet here, already is going to have a red flag with that. You're telling me I'm going to have order in my society, I'm going to have order in my community without the ancestors? That's interesting. All right, that's very interesting. We'll get more to that later on. We also get an understanding of peace from African perspective by just looking at Monday-born people in the Akan. And let's look at Monday-born males, Kwajo, peaceful aspect to this person, but there's also this strength, there's also this responsibility, right? So instead of the Eurocentric idea of peace where you're just calm and you're just a calm person walking around, an African perspective of peace is the person who is calm, who is strong, but who's also willing to meet the challenge of bringing things back into order, who has the force, who has the focus, who has the wisdom to bring things back in order. That is a peaceful man or a peaceful woman. Not somebody who's trying to avoid conflict, not someone who's... That's not what it is for us. That is an Indo-European perspective of peace. What we get from a Black ancestral perspective is this relationship of peace to justice. And if we would take it as the yin and yang symbol, there's a harmony between peace and justice. In order for there to be peace, there must be justice. And justice is there to restore peace, because essentially when you look at the languages, the African languages, you look into the Kemetic language, you will see that peace is directly related to harmony and order. And there can be no order without justice. While the Western perspective is going to say that peace, what we would call order, is related to transcendence, related to rising above the problem, essentially detaching yourself from the problem. And this goes all into the Greco-Roman philosophy of peace being the absence of emotions. We must understand that this idea of being absent of emotions, of taking emotions out of the equation, is a Greco-Roman thought. That is Aristotle, that is Plato, that is not Black ancestral. So when you have people with black skin who are promoting these ideas that emotions are bad, that is what is said in the yogic text. That is what is said in the philosophical text of Europe, of Greece, of Rome. That is not what is said in Kemet, that your emotions are bad. Once again, what I said earlier about the linear, vertically integrated model of the way that Europeans think will eventually create a cognitive dissonance or a delusion. We cannot exist on this planet without emotions. Our brain is hardwired. Your instincts are directly connected to your emotions, right? We see in modern spirituality all this talk about emotions as energy and motion. Where's the practical consideration for that? Where's the practical application for that? In the brain, your instincts, are connected to your emotion, and your instincts are an aspect of intuition. And that's why, as you see things advance, people are talking about what? Emotional intelligence, right? As the key to resolving what? Relationships. As we said, Black ancestral traditions, the African way, the indigenous way is relational. Wusser is relational, right? And you need emotions when you are dealing with relationships, how to understand what somebody's going through. That is a communal people. That is someone who's engaging with reality, while the European perspective is an individualistic one that wants to detach from reality. Reality is evil. Reality is hell. This is a prison. This is an illusion. This is Maya. You understand? Why would God, why would Kanun, when you're created, give you an amygdala, which is a threat detection? We're viewing this in the eyes of these ideas of peace, these ideas of oneness that are Eurocentrically based. Why would you have an amygdala as a threat detection center, which will either trigger anger, which to put up a boundary, or trigger fear for you to flee, fight, flight, all those things go into that? Why would you have something like that that would trigger an emotion of fear if it's evil, if that may save your life? What I'm saying here is that your brain, your nervous system is hardwired for you to experience emotions. So the idea of suppressing them is what truly leads to you uniting with God and what truly leads to a balanced world. We're still waiting for those receipts. We're not even talking about the last 50, 60 years of modern spirituality. We're talking about the last 2,000. Let's talk about the last 200. Where are the receipts that this is true? Because for us, for Black ancestral people, Kemetic-African people, it must be practical. It must be relational. We must have some receipts. When we say that we invoke the ancestors, when we say that the ancestors said this, this, and this, there's receipts of it. Because what they say has come true. There's receipts that you live on after death. There's receipts of reincarnation. It's not just an idea that you must believe in. We experience it. There's an engagement. And when it comes to the Kemetic ideas and African ideas of oneness, remember the modern spiritualist perspective of oneness has to do with dishonest harmony. There's really no conflict between us. We're cool, we're laughing, we can go hang out with it. Right? And ultimately, this idea of oneness is to transcend race and all these distinctions. That aligns with Brahma, that aligns with Kether and the Kabbalistical tree of life. Brahma and Kether is a dissolution of identity, a dissolution of these boundaries, as they would say, return to the source, right? Rise above race. And of course, this rising above race and identities will be used, as we said in our first episode of Modern Spirituality, the colonization of spirit. It will be used to absolve the people who are oppressing, the people who have enslaved your ancestors. It will be used to absolve them of it. As I've said time and time again, that the onus, the person who really has to do the work to transcend these ideas of race, are the oppressed peoples themselves. It's all the pain that you've experienced, the pain that you're feeling, the pain of your ancestors, in your blood, in your genetics, that you have to suppress, you have to be at peace with, so that you can unite with the same people who are still oppressing you, and also the people where you have not received just compensation for what they've done. As I said earlier, that's why peace does not exist without justice from a Black ancestral perspective, because what they are asking Indo-European spirituality with these ideas of oneness is for you to forget about. You don't need justice, just forgive. You don't need justice. Let's just move forward together. Before we move into the other aspects of Wusser and the other African traditions, I want to elaborate more on the earlier concept about this higher self, lower self stuff, because this is fundamental to modern spirituality and its imposition on Black African spirituality and philosophical thought is downright criminal. I said it, criminal. We don't view things in that manner. Once again, that is the linear, oppositional, linear, vertically integrated model of a top-down approach. Set is not lower than Wusser. One of the things that people have a problem with is that they leave the three Abrahamic faiths. They might leave Christianity or Islam mostly, and they believe by coming over to yogic spirituality or what is being defined as spirituality, they leave those things behind, but they don't understand that they're cousins. And the same principles that exist in Christianity get repackaged in modern spirituality, because modern spirituality is governed and controlled by the Western Esoteric traditions, who by themselves and by their own words have said that they represent a more esoteric or more energetic form of Christianity. This higher self, lower self comes from the Christian doctrines of flesh versus spirit. In Christianity, the flesh instincts are associated with sin, and spirit is what? Good, right? So flesh and instincts are bad, they're sinful, and spirit or God, immaterial, is good. And so from their own philosophical and spiritual approach, there is a conflict, inner conflict. As we said with the Greco-Roman philosophical piece, one has to be destroyed. Good and evil do not coexist traditionally according to the Indo-European perspective of life. There is good, evil, and whatever is evil must be destroyed. So the lower self must be destroyed. The flesh and the instincts must be destroyed. That's where you get this idea of leaving your body, that the body is filthy. The body is a prison. Let's leave the body behind because we have to get closer to God, to spirit. This is what they said in the yogic text. It's not much different than what is said in the Bible or the Christian theology. Now, in African cosmology, this inner conflict does not exist. There is an interconnectedness, an interdependence, a ma'at, a ma'ar, an order to this relationship. Right. So now let's get into Wuser and the other African traditions, as I like to call it, the black coffee. No cream, no sugar. So we'll start with the Yoruba and start with Obatala. As you know, Oba means king, connected to Wuser, Ausar being a king in Kemet, and is known as the calm, wise father figure. But he's also known as someone who is, when things are off, he is willing to bring justice to a situation, to calm it, to bring order to it. And because of this, Obatala has warrior paths. So Obatala is not just a wise, benevolent, calm man filled with wisdom. He's also filled with the weapons and the ability to bring justice where justice is needed. So we're going to mention a few of his warrior paths. Obatala Ayaguna. If they say this path is connected with the Orisha Shango, and although he carries a cane, he is fearless, combative, and a warrior. They say that he came to fight from Africa to Asia, the Benin Empire, and in Nigeria there are connections with China, connections with Asia. As we'll see later on, there's a path of Obatala that rides a tiger, and you know there ain't no tigers in Nigeria. There are tigers in Asia. The next Obatala path we'll be talking about is the young warrior, Obatala Acho. He also wears a red ribbon around his waist in the same way that Obatala Ayaguna wears. So this part of Obatala, it brings in this entrepreneurial energy when it goes with his warriorship. People usually pray to him when they need a job, or they pray to him for prosperity and money. So you see this martial entrepreneurial endeavor come in with this Obatala. And from going back to the African cyclical horizontal worldview, the calling on this path of Obatala, someone having this path of Obatala, we will see will be directly in line with the African perspective of peace, right? Because there's a relationship between peace and justice. Having an entrepreneurial energy, calling on this path for prosperity is directly impactful to people in the diaspora because we are suffering at the bottom of the economic ladder. So in this case, Obatala or Wuser is not detached from reality, but is directly engaged with the needs of our people. It's called Obatala. This next path of Obatala is called Obatala Ekanike. He's a warrior and guardian of a city, and he also uses gunpowder, right? Another reference to the relationship with China. The next path is Obatala Anasware. They call him the Lord of Suffering. Walks around with 2 machetes. Right, so there are other paths of the warrior aspect of Obatala, but this is very important because even when we see regular pictures of Obatala, he has a sword in his hand. Now, if you listen to modern spirituality, they will go and tell you that, no, the sword is just a symbolism of truth. What is the practical aspects of a person having a sword and they're dealing with truth? Oh, you're cutting through falsehood. That is an Indo-European perspective. What falsehood are they referring to? They're referring to Maya, to the illusions of the world. That's not what we mean. What we mean when Obatala has a sword and is cutting for truth goes back to the Kepesh sword of Kemet, goes back to the fact that Ma'ar, the Medut, is a sickle, which is used to cut things, not just vegetables, but also used as a weapon for farmers. So cutting with truth, discerning truth, being precise. with truth, or having to disrupt the chaos with the sword, taking out the rebels, crushing the rebels, as we will see later with a form of Wuser that crushes the rebel, is all a part of the practical aspects and how we deal with reality and how we deal with our spirituality. And so these perspectives, the astrological placement of the Yoruba Obatala have a lot to do with when the sun is in fire signs, particularly Aries, or when there is a Sun-Mars conjunction. Moving on to the Khan tradition, where Wuser shows up on Sunday-born males and Monday-born males as a Wusi and as Ado. A Wusi is embodying the solar force of fatherhood. Ado, embodying the qualities of the moon, is embodying this peaceful, calm, but strong man. And in the Akan, a Wusi and Adwo, both solar and lunar connection is very important, because when you see Wuser Ausar projected in modern spirituality, he's projected only focusing on his so-called death part, right? He's projected as a powerless force, as a force that lacks energy. But here we have in the Akan, he clearly is associated with these planetary bodies that deal with force and power. Moving on to Haitian Vodou, Da or Dangbe, the royal serpent of fertility and life. Moving on to the Mande cosmology, the Mandinka, where Wuser in that tradition is called Pharaoh. Right? And as I said earlier, we have a cyclical horizontal perspective of life. In the Mande cosmology, you see Pharaoh and Pemba, right? The same concept of Wuser's body being split up into multiple pieces and spread around the world. The same thing happens to Pharaoh. Moving on to the Dogon. And what a lot of people don't know is that the Dogon cosmology, which is something in diaspora we talk often about, the elements of Dogon cosmology come from Mande cosmology because of the interactions of both people. And so in the Dogon, you have obviously the story of Urugu, which they usually call Oko. This is what Set or the fox would be. And then you have the Nomo, which represents the what? The Nomo represents these aspects of Wuser because the Nomo are associated with water. And water is the association that Ausar has with the Nile. They say that we drink the body of the Nomo. In some of the stories, the Nomo's body is split up and cast in all directions and then brought back together later, resurrected. The qualities of Wuser. In the Igbo, we have Agu Ensi. In the particular stream of energy, Omumu energy, the fertility energy that we see with Wuser. Now, before we move on to Wuser and what was said about him in Kemet, we have to understand that we just Igbo, Dogon, Mande, Akan, Yoruba, and Haitian Vodou. 6 different traditions where we see Wuser manifest. So later on, we get to a certain famous statement that a certain so-called guru made. There's not really much surviving material on Wuser. Well, in Africa, there's already at minimum, the 6 traditions we just mentioned. We're not even talking about the Bantu. We're not talking about the Oromo. We're not talking about the other tribes in which your blood might be connected with and how you honored Wuser or the father in Ter in that tradition. So as we move on to Kemet, it's very important to understand that Wuser is not as old as some other father in Teru. One of the things that have to be said is that men, Ptah, Khnum, the Nubian Hekaimaak are older versions of what we would recognize Wuser as in terms of being a father figure. I'm not saying they're different forms. They are other interior who take on many of the roles that Wuser takes on. Now, it's important to say that because if you will listen to modern spirituality, listen to what some of these black gurus say out here, listen to what the Egyptologists say, they act like the story of Aset, Ausar, and Heru is the only story, is the oldest story, is the ultimate story. Right? But that is not true. That is the story that the Europeans and Egyptologists choose to focus on because it promotes their own agenda. Now, as we start to go to Wuser, we'll notice a theme that even Wallace Budge picked up, which is that Wuser is considered to be an ancestor of human beings. We're talking about black people. It's considered to be an ancestor of us. Right. And you'll see that theme in other African traditions that he is in, where he's considered a great ancestor. He's considered to be a great father. Aset is considered to be a great mother. Now, why is this important? It's important because the way that Wuser is marketed today in modern spirituality, even by so-called black gurus, there's no mention of any kind of ancestral reverence. No serious one. right? All the ways that he's engaged with, all the ways that he is talked about are talked about with an absence of ancestors. And that's understandable, right? Because the Indo-European perspective on life and spirituality disrupts and removes ancestors, does not even consider. So when we go on to this particular form of Wuser, Oser Eya, or Osar Ya, this connects with the Ado of Akan. When we see Wuser or Osar An, right, considered to be the so-called solar god, this connects with Awusi. When we mention a form of Osar, Osar Neb Peti Pet Pet Sebar, the crusher of the rebels, the Lord of Might. When we mentioned the form Osar Tem Ur, the great executioner, now we start talking about Yoruba and Obatala. Now we start talking about the paths of Ayaguna, Acho, and the paths that we mentioned earlier. So all of these ideas, these modern ideas that Wuser is just this defenseless, passive, detached, and tear, does not align with Black ancestral tradition. If there is injustice, because peace for us, order for us, oneness for us is connected and inseparable from justice. So of course Wuser would have to get busy. Of course he would have that path. Everything in nature has that path. Plants, animals, everything has a defense mechanism, has an immune system to push out invaders. So even the idea of a promotion of a Wuser who does not have these boundaries has to make you automatically question psychological warfare, spiritual warfare. Why would this Black deity be presented as one who lets everything happen, absorbs everything, and accepts everything? A lawless, essentially, entair. And then say that it comes from a culture that is based on law. Ma'at. So when people talk about Ma'at is love and all this stuff, or even they say unconditional love, Ma'at is unconditional love. There's no such thing as unconditional love, right? Because love is connected to law. Law by its very nature is conditional, has boundaries. Meaning that our Wuser will have boundaries. Clearly he has boundaries because when he is killed by Set, Heru has to come and deliver justice. If there was no boundaries and he was supposed to just accept everything, there would be no story of Heru coming to restore the land and bring justice in the world. That's right there in the story. Our ancestors are telling you that, not this foolishness that exists out here, this corruption, this psychological warfare on the minds of the descendants, those people who told those stories, who lived those realities practically. Now, it would be wrong to talk about Wuser from a Black ancestral perspective if we don't mention some astrology. Right? As we say in our Kemetic astrology videos, astronomy is universal, astrology is cultural. And what you will see is that the astrology that is presented about Osar is either it's not presented at all or it's particularly inaccurate, or rather it does not serve the agenda of what is in the other African traditions and does not really serve what we need in the world. And you will see serves more of a Eurocentric corruption. So briefly, one of Wuser's titles is he who dwells in the house of Serket. Now, Serket is what is called Scorpio. We don't call it Scorpio, and we'll get into that in our Kemetic Scorpio video. But he dwells in the house of Scorpio, right? Now, the sign of Scorpio is aligned with the nome that is called by the Greeks Abydos, what we called Ta'ur, what we call Ebtu, as it is said in the pyramid text. This is where Wuser is killed. As we said in the first video of Kemetic-African, there's a sign where Wuser is killed. There is a sign where his pieces are put back together. There's a sign where he is resurrected, right? And these different parts of our chart dictate certain ideas, certain approaches to life that are specific to Kemetic astrology. And so him dwelling in the house of Serket in the sign of Scorpio brings in the understanding of the connection between Scorpio and the constellation of Orion, which is called Sa in Kemet. And now, of course, because he's associated with Serket being an inter of Scorpio, then his themes of death, resurrection, and rebirth then to begin to make more sense. The fact that he's associated with the Nile River, Scorpio's a water sign, begins to make sense. The fact that he's associated with the underworld, with Scorpio world, begins to make sense. Now, Scorpio is a part of the duat, is a part of the duat. Scorpio is not the whole duat. Pisces is where we talk about the main parts of the duat. There are other parts of the duat which we'll get into at another time. Now, the connection between Wuser and Serket goes further because Serket has a title that is she who breathes life. That is a part of the resurrection. The name that we call Scorpio is Hekaimaak. And one of the reasons why we call it that name is because it's very important that when you're dealing with the 8th house of astrology, that from a Kemetic perspective, the idea and practice of justice, of order, is very much involved when it comes to the 8th house, which is what the Western esoteric traditions are based on. The occult has within it, because of the lack of boundaries that we see today, has within it the propensity to go to what we would call evil behavior or corrupt or criminal behavior, right? Scorpio has a big thing with power dynamic. And we'll get to the specifics of that when we talk about the astrology of slavery later on. Okay, so before we move into the Indo-European perspective of Ausar, what I call pouring cream in the coffee, it's important to reiterate that our model of our approach to Wuser and our approach to peace is that it is inseparable without justice. That is our relationship. It's further confirmed in the fact that Wuser's association with Hekaimaak means that it is governed by the planet Mars, the planet of war, the planet of defense. We go to Yoruba. Obatala walks around with a sword. He has his warrior path. We go to the Akan with Awusi. We go to the Igbo and you read about the different manifestations of Agu and Si and the different things that can be done. And then we go back to Kemet with Wuser Tem Urd. Ausar Tem Urd, Wuser, the crusher of the rebels. You have a very clear picture that how Black ancestral traditions deal with Wuser is, yes, the peace. And that peace does not take place without the martial action, the Yapti chakra, the manipulative chakra action to restore it. That's how we do it. Now let's move on to the cream and the coffee, how the Indo-Europeans perceive it. As we said earlier, it must be stated that these perceptions of Wuser, the perception of Kemetic spirituality, does not take place without Egyptologists and Western esoteric traditions superimposing their cultural bias, their racism, their theory on Kemetic spirituality. A lot of cream was poured and is still being poured in the coffee. Western esoteric traditions frame peace as a individual experience, this inner stillness, this personal enlightenment, this freedom from internal disturbance. What is missing there? Everybody else. Your family, the community, the world. It's just about you. That's why we say that our model is a relationship between peace and justice, while their model is a relationship between peace and transcending the physical world. And so Wuser is presented as that, as this detached being who, when you achieve him, you have detached from the physical world. That's not us. Also, their perspective of peace tends to be static. It tends to be a singular origin that does not move versus the Kemetic perspective of a dynamic sense of peace, because what? It cycles. What I do in the summer to establish order is not the same thing that I do in the winter. And what I do in the spring to establish order is not the same thing that I do in the fall. So it's a constant movement versus the state of inaction that is described in Kether of the Tree of Life, of the Kabbalistical Tree of Life. As we said earlier, peace in the European model, in the linear, vertically integrated model, is one that is absent of emotion. So Wuser is portrayed as a being who is above emotions and above instinct. Right? And of course, their whole relationship with Wuser and Set is that Wuser is the higher self, Set is the lower self. Wuser has this top-down hierarchical approach. He's supposed to dominate. They say he's passive, but apparently he's supposed to dominate Set, because Set is just this evil being, right? Because they're bringing in the Christian theology of that flesh and the body is evil, which is the same thing that is said in the yogic tradition. So Wuser is this great superior being of spirit who is defenseless, who is passive, who is just still in static. Now, in the Black spiritual space, in the Kemetic spiritual space, the most popular leader in Kemetic spirituality, which has shaped how we view Ausar, is Ra Un Nefer Amen, or has been Ra Un Nefer Amen. And as we will see, his approach to Wuser aligns more with a linear, vertically integrated model that is much more in alignment with Indo-European tradition and conflictual and oppositional to what the Kemites actually said. Now let's start with Ra Un Nefer Amen's seminal work, Misinterpretation Volume 1, the book that most people in the Black spiritual space swear by. Let's start with what he said about Kemetic spirituality and about African cosmology. So on page 72 in his Misinterpretation Volume 1, he states, Preceding exposition of the creative process is one of the best examples of the claim by Kabbalists that the mythologies and religious scriptures of nations cannot be fully understood without the knowledge of Kabbalah. Ra Un Nefer Amen just said that we cannot truly understand African cosmology and therefore Kemetic spirituality without the assistance of Kabbalah, which is Indo-European cultural perspective and view of the world, that would be used to perceive what the Africans, the black people, were saying. This also implies that Kemetic-African traditions need the external validation or interpretation through the European lens. Now, why is that a problem? It's because the same people that he is saying that we need the validation of, or we need their interpretation to understand ourselves, are already committed to destroying us. These same people who he's saying we should use what they believe or what they say, their perspective on us, are the ones whose ancestors were responsible for enslaving and creating the conditions of what we call institutionalized racism. The same people who are making the plans to oppress our children. These are the people who he is saying that we should listen to understand our Kemetic ancestors. He didn't even mention our own ancestors. He didn't even mention our own ancestors, which is traditionally how we would begin to understand ourselves and understand our ways in the world, as well as our community. And this statement fits in line with what the Western Esoteric traditions have told the world, which is that they are the keepers of this secret wisdom. And the secret wisdom they refer to, they say, is the secret wisdom of ancient Egypt. Whether you believe it or not, that is a big problem, because there's no mention really of them in the way that they perceive themselves today in Kemet before really the new kingdom, like in some sense of power, some sense of influence. So why would we take a people who themselves have said that their powers, that their wisdom is around the new kingdom and really the end of Kemet, take that as the foundation of how we should perceive our spirituality? That makes no sense. This perspective of being a gatekeeper for our African wisdom is also saying that he believes that he is the gatekeeper of how we should perceive Wusir, even if it's not what the other Africans, what the other black ancestral people have said. So this is very important. This is a very important statement, because it also adds to what he said consistently, that there is really no surviving material of Wusir. He's made claims that the library was burned. He only had a little bit to work from, which was really a justification to use the yogic and the Indo-European and the Western Esoteric traditions to compile this perspective of Wusir that we have today. As we just saw, there are multiple, there is a plethora, there is a fertile basis of information about Wusir just on the African continent alone. And this library burning that he refers to happened around 48 BC. Kemet has already been, there's so much cream that has been poured in the coffee that any information about Wusir at that time has to be taken with a grain of salt and is questionable anyway, as we will see later on. Now, why would Ra Un Nefer Amen say that we could not fully understand or interpret Kemetic spirituality and therefore could not fully understand Wusir without the Kabbalah or without a Eurocentric lens? Let's go back to his origin. He is a self-proclaimed Rosicrucianist. That's where he started. Now let's listen to what the Rosicrucianists themselves say about their own origin. The AMORC sees itself as a continuation of the ancient mystery schools of Amenhotep IV in Solomon. These are references to Akhenaten. Rosicrucianists believe that God created the universe according to his immutable laws. This is where Ra Un Nefer Amen gets the concepts of Ma'at 11 laws. Man's success is through mastership, the ability to bring into material expressions one's mental imaging. The techniques taught to students lead to mastery. For example, students are taught to image or imagine such things as health, wealth, and happiness, and thereby to draw those things to themselves. Now, is that not the basis? Is that not the basis of the meditation system, called meditations, that Ra Un Nefer Amen promotes, not just in this book, but also for us and other people who have been a part of that community? So we see word for word the same thing that the Rosicrucianists have said is what he has superimposed on Kemet. And there's more. Let's talk about the people who started this particular version of Rosicrucianism, in which he was the leader of, and which clearly has gone into his interpretations of Wusser and Kemetic spirituality. So let's start with Rudolf Steiner, a student of theosophy, a student of the occult, a person who said that he wanted to deal with the issues that were concerning Germans. And therefore, he founded this esoteric movement of this particular portion of Rosicrucianism to deal with German ideals. See, his problem with theosophy, which was started by Madame Blavatsky, was that he felt that the theosophy was moving too much towards the Indo-European, towards the yogic practices, and he wanted something that was more European to serve his people. And he was very upfront about the undercurrent of Christian Gnosticism within that. There's nothing wrong with wanting to serve your people and take care of his people, but clearly, if he is concerned with Christian Gnosticism, if he's concerned with the esoteric elements of solving Western problems, that has nothing to do with Black people and African people. And so when he made statements such as spiritual science, these are the same statements that get regurgitated by Ra Un Nefer Amen. And so his perspective, as I said, we have a different worldview. He has a linear, vertically integrated perspective of life and religion. What does that mean? So his perspective on life was not to solve the problems of Black people. In fact, he actually said something that we would call racist. And I quote, "To what extent are uncivilized peoples capable of becoming civilized? How can a Negro or an utterly barbaric savage become civilized? And in what way ought we deal with them?" This is what he said in The Occult Significance of Blood, 1906. This is what he said about Black people. And what's more, he clearly said, how ought we deal with them? We have to understand that he has had relationships with, from being an Austrian, he has had relationships with Germany and Hitler until Hitler and the Nazi party rejected his beliefs and his work. There was a relationship. And we bring that up because when he says how we deal with them, don't we know that eugenics was a big part of the work of the Germans and the work of Hitler? Not only that, but it's not surprising his racism, right? Because theosophy has a history of racism. Madame Blavatsky is a confirmed racist. And Ra Un Nefer Amen quotes her regularly. And his students are on the internet quoting her, saying things such as sages regularly mention her when she has gone out of her way to say that Black people, African people are inferior. Let's read one of her quotes from The Secret Doctrine, Synthesis of Science, Religion, and Philosophy. Before we read one of the quotes that she said in her book, I must reiterate that she's saying her perspective on science, how the world works, her perspective on religion, how God works, her philosophy of how she is supposed to proceed in life is based upon what I'm about to say. Page 421, mankind is obviously divided into God-informed men and lower human creatures. The intellectual difference between the Aryan and other civilized nations and such savages as the South Sea Islanders is inexplicable on any grounds. No amount of culture, nor generations of training in civilization could raise such human specimens as the Bushmen, the Vedas of Ceylon, and some African tribes to the same intellectual level as the Aryans, the Semites, and the Turanians. The sacred spark is missing in them, and it is they who are the only inferior races on the globe, now happily owning to the wise adjustment of nature, whichever works in that direction, fast dying out. Wow, what a statement. What a statement. And she said many more statements. But let's understand that she just said that there were God men and there were inferior men. Does Ra Un Nefer Amen constantly talk about superior men and God men and then inferior men? Straight from his fairy godmother, Madame Blavatsky. And she's even making a reference to nature destroying Black people. What is she talking about? Is this not possibly a reference to eugenics? Now, we must also understand that when she wrote this book, This comes out a few years after the Berlin Conference, the so-called Scramble for Africa, where the European nations decided to colonize and to split up Africa into the lines that we see it today. This is no coincidence. She also makes statements in this book about one reality and the indivisible reality and the consciousness and matter, which is the same way as he describes Wuser, and that the way that he's been describing Wuser for 50 years. I don't know about you, but I'm sure that Madame Blavatsky does not understand Wuser, does not understand Ausar, and she doesn't understand Aset, even though she wrote a book about unveiling Isis a decade before this book. What I'm saying is that Madame Blavatsky's work, theosophy, Rosicrucianism, the Golden Dawn, all of these are the fundamental foundations of Western esoteric traditions, along with Kabbalah. This filter, this lens, is what Ra Un Nefer Amen said is necessary. And he didn't just say it, he acted. Look, it's necessary to understand Kemetic spirituality. But I don't know about you, but I'm sure that a racist cannot understand who I am and what I'm supposed to do and what my destiny is and what my relationship with God is. In fact, if these people were to tell me that, how different would that be from Christianity and the Bible telling me that? As I said, they're cousins, modern spirituality and the three Abrahamic faith. So these are the formation of the teachers, the European daddies, and the fairy godmothers of Rosicrucianism and the perspective that Ra Un Nefer Amen have, or Rosicrucianist Reggie, as we sometimes call it. And it must be noted that these so-called laws, these mutable laws in which she spoke about, the Rosicrucianists have a lot of these laws. They mention them. And what you will find is that they are word for word the same laws that he superimposed on Kemetic-African, right? The so-called law of Herukuti, word for word, the same as the Rosicrucianist law of cause and effect. His approach to Ma'at, which is not ancestral, these ideas of unconditional love and giving, seeking nothing in return, is the exact same things the Rosicrucianists have said about the cosmic law that governs the universe. Verbatim. But what we really want to focus on is the statements from the Rosicrucianists about Akhenaten and the so-called mysteries that they claim that they came from in Kemet. As you know, that Akhenaten, he's given, according to the European, according to the Western Esoteric traditions, and of course, according to Christianity, he's given this great moniker of the first one to talk about monotheism, which Ra Un Nefer Amen uses as his justification of what he's calling the Part Neteru and the superimposition of the Tree of Life on Black spirituality, as we will show going forward. Now, one of the things that we want to say before we proceed with this monotheism and Akhenaten, we must understand that Akhenaten was rejected by the Black ancestral traditions, the Nubians, the Black people, the people who are Black on the inside, rejected what Akhenaten did. The history shows that. So when we look at it, when we frame it properly, we can see that the only ones who actually approve of and support of and think that what he did was good were clearly the Europeans. And Ra Un Nefer Amen used this as a way to justify how we view Wuser and how this so-called Osirian religion proceeds. Now let's start with the book of Knowing the Manifestations of Ra. Ra Un Nefer Amen says that on page 51 of his Mutir Volume 1, he states that this was written around 2500 BC. And he says, and I quote, "Here we have a written confirmation that monotheism existed in ancient Egypt much earlier than the birth of Abraham and over 1,000 years before Akhenaten and Moses." Now, after he says this, he goes on to talk about the same thing that Madame Blavatsky talked about with undifferentiated matter and consciousness. He goes on to talk about God is omnipresent and omnipotent and omnipotent, all these things which his students and people who have read his books understand that these are the basis of his philosophy, the basis of his understanding of what he calls the tree of life or the Part Neteru. So let's start with the problems with this so-called text. It was not written around 2500 BC, and the doctrine is not much older, and it was not written 1,000 years before Akhenaten. This text was written in the late period, somewhere around and later than the 26th dynasty. There's so much cream in the coffee, we don't even recognize the blackness anymore in it. This is when this text was written. How do we know this? The script used in the papyrus Bremner Rhine is late Hierarchical, which is a period of time when Kemet was fully under the influence of Persia, of Greek, and the Hellenistic elements that Greek was bringing to astrology, bringing to the other aspects of the culture. The Ptolemy, who had loyalty to their Greco-Roman roots, were the ones who were running things. So this text is not only off because of the writing, but we also must actually read what they said about it. They said that, one, it is like no other text in Kemet. Two, you clearly see the Egyptologists trying to superimpose their Christian theology on it by making statements that never shares the everlasting God and the God of the upper limits, right? There are also statements that they make that do not align with statements that he makes. He calls this a creation story. They try to say it was a creation story, but then they contradict themselves later on in the text where they say that it's a ritual to overthrow Apep and the daily birth of Ra and the movement of Ra. These things conflict, and I'll tell you why they conflict. Because that text was not written by us. It was written by the Greco-Roman people who were in Kemet at this point. It's Egypt, who were trying to conflict or synchronize Osir and Ra together, as they had already done with Serapis. Also, another weird thing about this text is that they said the Supreme Being says that his name is Osiris. We say, oh, they must have been saying Osiris. No, he said Osiris. There's no other place in Kemet where that name pops up. And in fact, it sounds, it's Latin, which is what the Romans spoke. So let me conclude why this text is off. It's at the wrong time. It's not 1,000 years before Akhenaten, Ra Un Nefer Amen. It's actually 1,000 years after Akhenaten. I don't know if this is a typo in your work, but it's actually 1,000 years after Akhenaten. And it really calls into question why you would take this text and try to frame it at 2500 BC, which is the fourth dynasty, which is the Old Kingdom, which is the pyramid and coffin text. It really calls into question why you would frame it that way. Was it to give it the legitimacy of its blackness when it has no legitimacy in blackness and the authentic Nubio-Kemetic philosophy? Was that why you did it? Or was it just a misinterpretation of time and history, which you claim to be an expert? I will reiterate, late Hierarchic is a text that is written in the late period of Kemet. It did not exist in the Middle Kingdom. It did not exist in the Old Kingdom, meaning that no authentic Black ancestral perspective on. Furthermore, the clear impositions of the Egyptologists themselves to interject Christianity on it is also something that is questioned. This is not even a creation story. And this text is used to justify the perspective of what we see as Wusir. And I'll read it exactly as he wrote. Let's paraphrase the above by noting that all that was, is, and can never be are all modifications of the undifferentiated energy matter and unconditioned consciousness will of subjective being. Therefore, all that we have been, now are, and can never be are modifications of this original subjective being. This is what Madame Blavatsky said. So he's basing the falsehood of this text, the incorrect perspective of this text, the European lens on this text, and he's using what his fairy godmother, Madame Blavatsky, said about consciousness and energy to justify Kemetic spirituality. But it makes sense because he said that he could not interpret Kemetic spirituality without the Kabbalah or without a Western esoteric perspective. He then goes and superimposes African thought, Kemetic African thought, onto the Kabbalah, onto the Tree of Life, and does it under the guise that they had it wrong, does it under the guise that, oh, they're playing it down, right? And then conflates the Sephiroth with the Interu, the biggest mistakes that we've seen in the last 50 years.
Portals in the spirit, 11 faculties or doorways to power. We call them the Neteru. Other people like to call them angels and archangels and so on. We call them the Neteru. The Hebrew Kabbalists call them spheres, 11 spheres, or the Sephirah, the Sephiroth, and so on. Okay? But these are...
The Sephiroth are not, right? They're called emanations, while Interu, more correctly, are manifestations, not emanation. He states also that the Sephiroth, the angels, are the the angels, as they are portrayed in Christianity, are messengers of God. They have no autonomy. They are there to send a message, to share a message that God has sent. That's not what Interu do. They have personal autonomy, personal roles. They have personal agency in the world. As I said, our perspective, the African, the Black Ancestral worldview, a cyclical, horizontal perspective, approach does not have a rigid approach. Everyone is fulfilling their role within the cycle. Versus, it makes sense why angels would have a limited autonomy when you consider the rigid hierarchical perspective of the Indo-European approach to life and approach to spirituality. It's highly likely from their own words and their own history and what they've written down that they cannot invoke those Interu and those spirits. That is a big difference of our approach to spirituality. And that is why for us, spirituality is more relational. When I say that Shango said something to me, that is not, I'm not abstracting Shango. I'm not creating an archetype for Shango as a war. Shango actually spoke to me and told me to go do this as a part of a sacrifice, as a part of the work that I need to do to accomplish. In the Kabbalistical model, they were actually playing down and actually had the experience of invoking. You would not see so much abstraction. It is a very big thing in the Western and spiritual literature that tells us that that relational aspect with invoking and possessing Interu, gods, deities, is not something that is something that is experienced in European culture. Them raising their fiery energy and focusing on images of Thor, or trying to focus on Thor's qualities of bravery and courage, is not the same thing as actually possessing Thor, actually speaking to Thor, which there's not really record of any of it. So Ma'at is not Chesed of the Sephiroth. Sekerd, the Kemetic Interu, is not Bina, an abstract emanation of the one God. That's not the same. And so this framework of saying that this linear oppositional model, this tree of life, is the same thing as what was in Kemet, or saying this is the Kabbalistical understanding of what they were taught in Kemet, makes no sense because it is a linear oppositional model. Does this model look the same way as the Bakongo cosmogram? No. Does it look like the zodiac of Dendera? No. Does it look like the horizontal model of the Yoruba and the left hand and right hand paths? These are more models of Black ancestral traditions, of Kemetic-African thought. This over here is not. And so when he conflates the Neteru with being emanations instead of manifestate, the reason why we're mentioning this is because Ra Un Nefer Amen has had the nerve to say that this diagram of the tree of life, this linear oppositional model, is Ausar's body. He said that a Eurocentric perspective and view of life is the body of, in the pieces that were cut up and spread apart and sent to other places. This is not true. And it's been 50 years that this has been being said and spread. And when Black people try to find themselves, try to find Wuser in their life, they refer to this, which is historically and totally inaccurate. So what are the differences between an emanation and a manifestation? Let's start with emanation. Emanation describes the gradual hierarchical unfolding of divinity into lower levels of existence. The lower you go, the less and impure of divinity is. That's why in Christian theology, this idea of the fall, of the descent, Madame Blavatsky also mentioned in that book, they constantly mentioned in yogic traditions as well, in which she was heavily influenced by, this idea that the earth is not holy, that the earth is hell, that the earth is a prison. And he even says that in his own so-called tree of life, where you have Aset, or what he's calling Aset. Well, we don't say it's Aset. Where you have Isis, Hathor, Anubis, because I will not call them by their Kemetic names, because that is not a Kemetic theology or Kemetic perspective of life. You have Isis, Anubis, Hathor, and Djed, all considered to be what? From his own word, inferior, to be so-called less divine. So this idea that the lower is less divine and the higher is more divine is just mirroring the flesh and sin of Christianity. There's mirroring the earth being a prison, being a place that you need to escape in the yogic text. Now, what is a manifestation? A manifestation deals with the direct expression or appearance of divine energy or force in the world. The divine does not descend into lesser forms, but manifests as a part of an ongoing relational cyclical process. When the Orisha come down, when they manifest, when the Interu manifests, when the Aposom manifests on earth, they are no less divine than they were when they are in their animal forms, when they are in a constellation. They have no loss of power or status or divinity. That is our way. And there's no separation between the divine and the material. It's interconnected, it's interdependent. Look at the Dekenga cosmogram. It is interconnected. The spirit world is very much involved in what is happening in the material. So let's get down to another major aspect of how Ra Un Nefer Amen presents Wuser and Kemetic spirituality, or Kemetic spirituality, right? This concept of consciousness in will and no consciousness in the spirit. This duality, this separation does not exist in Kemet at all, or any African thought. Remember, the story that he is associating with Wuser being the Godhead or being the supreme God is a text that were written by the Greeks and the Romans, that were written with Persian influence, that were written at a time, there was nothing but cream in the coffee. There was no blackness in the coffee of Kemet. So it makes sense that he would make a statement like this, because this statement aligns with that perspective of life. Now let's get to the real disrespect of claiming that Ra is not conscious, or the not self, or as he says, the not self, that Ra is not conscious. How does a being who is the creator and the creatress, Ra, which he's never mentioned in 50 years, Ra's female side, his feminine half, how is the creator subordinate to Wuser? How is Ra subordinate to Wuser? How is he under him? We don't see in Yonkampon, which would be Ra in the Khan tradition, being subordinate to Awusi or Ado. We don't see that. We don't see Olorun or Olodumare being subordinate to Obatala in Europe. So why would that be this casing, right? Wuser is the child of Newton Geb. Newton Geb is the child of Tefnut and Shu, and Tefnut and Shu are the children of Ra and Ra. So once again, this statement, this projection that he has, where of Wuser, of consciousness and will, this is not Kemetic or African. We also need to understand that he's saying that the fundamental configuration of our being is governed by two male principles. Do we see that in any of the African or indigenous perspectives of life? This male-dominated creation and power is more in line with Indo-European power. Also, how could Ra, working through the sun, be not associated with any kind of consciousness when the sun itself, astrologically, and even based on even some esoteric texts, is associated with wisdom, is associated with awareness and consciousness? If you're going to say that consciousness will is Wuser, understand that when you start talking about will, you're talking about the Ab or the Eb. The Ab or the Eb in Kemet is associated with wisdom. That doesn't align with the fact that the Ab, the Eb itself, is a manifestation of energy, whether through the fact that it has wisdom, which you claim that wisdom information exists in Ra, in the not self, or the fact that the Ab is governed and controlled by the moon, which itself deals with a certain force. So this idea of consciousness will not having energy does not align with Kemet. And once again, he's separating consciousness and energy. That's not how life works. It doesn't work like that in modern quantum physics with the Western world. It didn't work like that in Kemet or any type of Black ancestral tradition. So what is he talking about? Let's get into more of the disrespect. He conflates Ra with Shakti. As I said, he has the two components of your so-called being governed by males, and then he's disrespecting Ra by saying that Ra is unconscious and Ra doesn't know what's going on, but at the same time saying that Ra is responsible for your talents and your mental capabilities. Well, if he's responsible for that, then that means that he has some type of consciousness. Mental faculties involve the movement of thoughts. Your nervous system, as it's engaging in because it's energy, as it's moving and firing, it's also creating and invoking thoughts, which have to do with consciousness. But because he equates Ra with Shakti in the Hindu and the Indian tradition, it makes sense why he would disrespect it. Because Shakti is blamed in the Hindu tradition for all the ills in the world. They say that Shakti governs Maya, the illusions of the world. And Brahma is clearly higher in the same way that he put Wuser in the Kemetic perspective. The world, and remember, Shakti governs the world and governs these illusions. And what are they trying to do? They're trying to escape the world. The world is a prison. The world is evil. It is not the same as saying that Eve is to blame in Christianity for the fall of the world. You see this way of life that devalues women and blames women and demotes them, subordinates them to the men. So here we have a patriarchal lens, not a patrilineal, but a patriarchal lens being imposed on Kemetic spirituality and then saying this is what your ancestors approved of. This is what they ate. This has been going on for 50 years, 60 years. That's not all. All right, so let's move on to his more detailed assessment or how he describes Wuser from their perspective, because clearly we can see that it's not Black ancestral, it's not African, no matter what you color him. Right, so right off the bat, he's saying that Wuser in the Kemetic tradition, he's associating Tem or Atem with Wuser. And let's talk about why that is a major misunderstanding. We know Tem or Atem to be a solar interroot, right? He is a seru from Ra, but he's also a part of that solar cycle, which according to Ra Un Nefer Amen system of consciousness and not self, he actually should be a part of the spirit and not the self-consciousness. So what's he doing over here? That's an inconsistency. That's a contradiction in your own hierarchy and your own structure. But let's talk about why he said that Wuser was Tem. Let's talk about the comprehension and the lack of understanding. He chose Tem because Tem also means no. It means negation. It means completion. And what he did was use that to superimpose the ideas of Brahma, of negation, of dissolution, of this oneness, this dissolution of boundaries that you see with Kether and the Tree of Life, and confound that with and then say, well, that must mean that he must be a part of Wuser because his ultimate goal is to deal with in this negation of consciousness and this idea of undifferentiated matter, which he got from Madame Blavatsky. Which she got from Brahma in the yogic tradition. He goes on to say that Wuser has no day or planet. Well, Obatala's day is Sunday. Or Wusi's day in the Khan is Sunday. Ado's day in the Khan is Monday. What what part of creation would lack a astrological or astronomical component according to Black ancestral traditions? So he's essentially saying that Wuser lives out of the boundaries of the confines of life itself. There's no basis for that in the fact that Wuser is tied to renewal and resurrection and fertility already puts him under the auspices of the moon and the sun. The fact that he's associated with the now, and the now rises and falls, which is based on the sidereal rising of a star. There's already an astronomical component in all that he does and all as he is represented from a Black ancestral perspective. And remember, this is only leaking his agenda, which is to detach Wuser from time and detach Wuser from life, which is the Indo-European approach to God, right? The Christian God is operating outside of the world. He doesn't live here. And so things are going on because he's outside of creation. That is what he has attempted to do here and has been doing for the last 50 years. He also wrote in this document that Wuser is beyond emotion. And this idea of being beyond the influence of emotions, once again, does not align with a Kemetic-African thought. You need emotions when you are relating to people. Wuser has a wife and a son. He has to relate to them. He's judging souls in the duat. Emotions are a part of also understanding other people. So the fact that you would say that he has to be absent of it to be this all-seeing and all-powerful person, that is exactly what Plato and Aristotle said. To be a superior being, which they only were referring to as men being superior being, right? Because another thing that must be said is that when he's telling this story of Ausar and saying that this is Kemetic, you can clearly see who has the power and where the hierarchy is. Auset doesn't get that kind of power. In fact, Auset on his tree is down in the lower part of the spirit, and she's emotional. So she's emotional and he lacks emotions. So he's superior. You understand that he's superior, she's inferior. This is the Indo-European approach to life, an approach to relationship. As now we move on to when he is saying God men on earth and in the inner plane. Let's reread what Madame Blavatsky said in her Secret Doctrine, page 421. Man is obviously divided into God-informed men and lower human creatures, in which she goes on to say that the African people are the lower creatures and the lower humans. So why is he repeating something that a racist said and is superimposing it on Kemetic spirituality? Do they talk about that in the pyramid text? About this God men and lower creatures? Do they talk about this in the coffin text? They do not. Of course, because of how people behave, of course, because of roles and hierarchy, that's always going to exist in humanity. But this type of perspective of hierarchy is something that is essential and is a byproduct of Indo-European spirituality and not Kemetic-African spirituality. And the greatest piece that he's left out of Usair, that is a major disservice, is the ancestral role that even Budge acknowledged. Usair is considered to be an ancestor of people, humanity, African people in particular. He's considered to be an ancestor. So how is it that somebody can be a God man and all this on the inner planes and all this stuff, and there's no mention of ancestors? When the texts say that the Akut, the great ancestors, are in the Sekhet Aru with Usair. How can you expect to be a perfected being? We would not even be talking about perfected, so-called perfected being, a moral being without the engagement or the advice or the wisdom or the protection of our ancestor. And the Akut themselves embody the legacy, the wisdom, and the stability of Usair. The Akut act as intermediaries between the living and the divine. This is across all culture. The ancestors represent power. But of course, in the Indo-European model, the ancestors are removed. They're removed. And in some cases, such as theosophy, they're replaced with ascended master. He also goes on to say that Usair retires from the world, from the tumult of illusion. So now he just said the Usair views the world as an illusion. But we know that that is only in the Indo-European model of yoga, that the world is viewed as illusion. And also this idea of retirement from the world. Remember, they want to escape reality. The world is hell. This idea of retirement. Anyone who's invoked their ancestor, we're not talking about abstractions. I think my ancestors told me to do that. You actually spoke to an ancestor. Ancestor spoke to you. This is all throughout multiple African and indigenous traditions. Know that the ancestors are not retired. They work. I mean, this is one of the reasons why we pour libation. One of the reasons why we put food on the shrine, to give them energy, to give them power. They're working. They're protecting us, they're providing us wisdom. They're sharing with us what is coming in the future. They're helping us with the lessons that we need to know in that moment, providing us that wisdom. So this idea of retirement, like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? But it does align with the statements made of when people achieve enlightenment in the European and Indo-European spirituality and the Western Esoteric traditions. When you finally achieve enlightenment and you'll be at rest or at so-called at peace, right? Passivity that occurs after you have achieved your so-called evolution. Once again, Usair, we don't view the world as an illusion, as something to escape. Usair would not represent the characteristics of regeneration and resurrection if he was just going to retire into the spirit world. That doesn't make any sense. And this notion of retirement aligns more with the ascetic traditions from Hinduism, where spiritual fulfillment involves renouncing the material world. I will reiterate, he said himself that you cannot understand Kemetic spirituality and understand no text without Kabbalah, without Western esoteric traditions. And we see it filtering through in everything that he is saying and that he has said for 50 years. Let's get deeper into his conflicts with the fundamentals of Black ancestral traditions and African spirituality, which we will speak about from a Kemetic perspective of the Ka, which is the R.E.A.L in Yoruba and which is the Okra in the Akan. This is what he says. That we can take on any of the personality types. The manipulation of mantras is the logical conclusion of the fact that we were made in the likeness of God. He then goes on to say, the Kemetic tradition states that each man has, in addition to himself, 7 personalities, Ka, plural of ka, Kemetic word for person and personality, and must lean into give full expression to all. So to my Khan brothers, he just said that you got 7 okras. That sound weird, don't it? To my Yoruba brothers and sisters, he just said that you have 7 Ori-Inus, and you need to give full expression to all 7. You got 7 heads. Does that make any sense? It doesn't make any sense. It's not true. What makes it even worse is that one of Wuser's titles is the Great, and he's expounding that he's an expert. He's been an expert on Kemetic wisdom for 51 years, and he got such a fundamental piece about the Ka wrong. But it gets worse. He states that this individuated spirit, also called a Ka in the Kemetic tradition, the division of the spirit that contains all of these spheres, the 7th, 8th, and 9th, with their respective deities, is called Sahu by the Kemetians, the lower Ruach by the Canaanites, the Amandala by the Bantu, and Djed by the Europe. So with the Ka, the Ori-Inu, and the Okra being so fundamental to African spirituality, Black spirituality, he places it in his lower part of the spirit. Do you know what he says about the Sahu? He says it's the inferior part. It is the part with the animalistic part. It is the part that doesn't understand, that doesn't know. In the Osiris-Isis society, the Osiris-Set society, Sahu has been used as a label to describe immoral behavior, to describe bad behavior. So for my Bantu brothers and sisters, he just said that the Amandala, the power, is inferior, is a part of the lower part of the spirit. He just said that our Kra, is a part of the lower part of the spirit, the inferior part of the spirit. And what makes it worse is that while he's saying that the Ka is in the lower part of the spirit, he's got Wuser at number 1. And Wuser's title in Kemet is the Great Ka. You see this contradiction? This is bad. And what's more, he has students, an astrologer out here, who said that Yoruba people are wrong for saying that they're their Ori-Inu, that they don't know any better, that they would need to identify with Wuser as their true self, their true identity, which is what Ra Un Nefer Amen promotes. You see this labeling of Africans as not knowing, labeling of Africans as inferior is no different than what the 3 Abrahamic faiths have done. But let's talk about where he got that part, right? Because you can see where he messed up and where he misinterpreted certain Kemetic statements. Now, this statement about the Ka and Kemetic thought is not the imagination or fantasy as implied by the 7, which is Netzach in the Kabbalah, right? Remember, this is an abstraction. And by conflating the image with someone's sacred purpose and destiny, it reveals a lack of understanding of Kemet. Because what really happened was that he saw that image was another definition of Ka. So then he conflates it and puts it down in the 7th sphere and says, oh, well, if I imagine and I create images, then it must. No, that's not how it works.
When you see yourself as a divine being, you have a divine Ka. But if you see yourself as a human being controlled by emotions and sensuality, then your Ka, meaning, is that of a human being. So the Ka is your vision, your construct that you create for yourself in terms of how you see yourself and your way of functioning. You see that? And that image of your person survives your death for a period of time. You see that? And that's the faculty that is memorialized and ritualized.
Now remember, this sacred piece, this very important piece to Black people, by calling it inferior and putting it down in the lower part of the spirit, he's doing the exact same thing that Europeans have done with their colonial attitudes. Right. And what he has done is also plays right into their linear, vertically integrated perspective of life, where it also justifies them enslaving us and colonizing us, because after all, our spiritual practices are inferior. They're primitive. That's what he said. And that's what he said for 50 years. And now people on the continent and in the diaspora are looking at this as something that is superior. Okay. Disrespecting their ancestral heritage, disrespecting their ancestral legacy, as Ra Un Nefer Amen has done here, in favor of what they say is the truth and what is spirituality. Now, this is not just my interpretation or a Black ancestral interpretation. Ra Un Nefer Amen is being a Black Kabbalist. He's okay with being a Black Kabbalist. As I reiterate what he said in his own book, but let's see what the Europeans people have said about Ra Un Nefer Amen and Osiris Set Society, an African American offshoot of the Rosicrucian Anthroposophic League formed by R.A.A. Strong, who changed his name to Ra Un Nefer Amen and wrote books combining Rosicrucianism, occultism, Kabbalism, Taoism, and Buddhism with societal concerns specific for African Americans. Let's go to another one. In the 1970s, R.A. Strong founded the Osiris Set Society, a Rosicrucian organization dedicated to meditation and healthy living with African American community. Once again, R.A. Strong founded the Osiris Set Society, a Rosicrucian organization. Let's continue. The Osiris Set Society, a Rosicrucian body especially oriented to meet the needs of African Americans, was founded in the mid-1970s by R.A. Strong. Let's go to another one. Finally, the Osiris Set Society exists to apply Rosicrucian insights to the Afro-American situation. Let's look at this. In this chart, you see that when you go to Rosicrucianism, Osiris Set is under the main body of Rosicrucianism. And this one is the one that got me the most, where it says the Rosicrucian Anthroposophical League was founded in the 1930s, and R.A. Strong, one of its members, established the Osiris Society, which gained Rosicrucianism considerable momentum in Africa. Helped the Western Esoteric traditions to push forward their agenda in Africa. And that's why when you even see certain African teachers and African so-called elders and what they're saying to this day, they've referenced some of this work. Once again, disrespecting their ancestral heritage, their ancestral legacies in favor of something that they believe to be superior. When Ra Un Nefer Amen says that Osiris Set started in Harlem, when he says that he did a lecture and they let him use a building for all his classes, well, let's look at the address. The Rosicrucian Anthroposophical League, R.A. Strong, 226 West 138th Street. That's Harlem. It's uptown. On the west, right? Not too far from the Schomburg Library. And in this video, we have his student, Thoth Greekenberg, Antahuti Kamo, his master astrologer, interviewing him, asking him about the Medunter Oracle and asking him about Medunter Volume 1. And they both laugh when they describe how this book is considered to be a top book on Kabbalah. So he's perfectly okay with European approval, perfectly okay with this book and this work being looked at as Kabbalah. He's saying that it is.
We have done our best in the past 49 years. Well, 38 years since the Oracle has been out. Well, 49 years of teaching. We have done our best to educate the world in Kemetic spirituality. People of different ethnic background study my works, just not simply Black people. When I went to England, a couple of years after Medusa Volume 1 was written and published, I went into a bookstore in England, and it was the sister bookstore for Samuel Wisers Incorporated, and I went in the store with Clemency, and I didn't introduce myself, who I was, whatever, right? I just walked in and I'm looking in the Kabbalah section. So the young man, white man, it's a white bookstore, these are the people who are behind, the great occult tradition in England, Shakespeare was part of that. He was the Rosicrucian, emperor, in England. A lot of people don't know that. You see that? Was a Grand Master. So I went into the bookstore and I'm looking at the different books to see. I have a big library of Kabbalistical books. So I said, I'm here in England, and if there's a book that I haven't seen, it has to be in this bookstore. So I'm looking through, and the young man, walks up and says, "Can I help you?" I said, "No, I'm just browsing." He said, "Well, I see it looks like you're looking for a book in Kabbalah." So he points to me a book by John Fortune. And he says, "This is a good book to start with, but when you're really ready for the good hard stuff, you want to read this book." And it took out my literature, volume 1. And I said, "You read it?" He said, "Yeah, man. This is the heights of the teaching." And
what this means is that for the last 50 years, in interpretation of User, this is not Kemetic or Kemetic wisdom. This is Black Kabbalah. That is what it is. And that is what it will be looked at going forward. You will not say that it's Kemetic wisdom. You will not say that it is modern Kemetic spiritual teachings, because it is not. It is Black Kabbalah. But since I'm feeling good, I'll allow you to say Egyptian wisdom, because after all, the book of knowing the manifestations of Ra that you claim to be the basis of your system was written by the Greeks and the Romans anyway. The real Egyptians, right? Not Kemet. So I'll allow it. So in conclusion, as we have thoroughly shown who User is from a Black ancestral perspective, the real User, and who User is clearly not. Unfortunately, who he is not has been masqueraded, has been shrouded in European mysticism, and presented to African people, to Black people in diaspora as our ancestral work. Now, why is this video being presented? Because I lost my way back to finding my ancestral self. Me, just as many others who are watching this video, had a real intention, a real desire. I used to always say that I want to get as close to I remember being 17, 18, 16 years old saying I want to just get as close to the ancestors as possible. Close to ancestors as possible. And studying history constantly, learning about our ancestors, and then on my way down to this path, getting lost in what this esteemed elder in the conscious community recently said was getting lost in a spirituality that's shrouded in European mysticism. And I remembered that this elder once said this to me in a different way when I first met him 10 years ago. He saw me on a plane when I worked for Delta Airlines. I was a flight attendant for 5 years, and he saw me with a book, saw me with Medunator Volume 5 from Ra Un Nefer Amen, and it was on a trip back from Haiti. And he said, "That's a good book, but you need to study your history." And I felt so embarrassed. I felt like, nah, I've always been an avid study of history. Like I'm just getting into this book. This is new to me, and I felt so embarrassed. I felt so embarrassed. But I continued to read those books, and I still studied history, but I slowly came off of history. And even after that, probably a year after that, I was involved with this group where we were doing my op meetings on Sundays, and he had showed them there, having the other elders there. They were necessary for me to wake up and get out of this European mysticism, and his particular words were essential to returning to this path, to make sure that other people to wake up and as well as don't get lost on their path to understanding your ancestors. And that's why here at Astro Aura Nation, as Kendrick said, our spirituality electrifies and not pacifies with Eurocentric notions of being at peace and oneness. There are Black people who are going to be okay with saying that this is Black Kabbalah. They've rejected their ancestors anyway. They're like, I don't care. I like it. I feel enlightened. You stay over there. But for those Black people and the people in the diaspora that are trying to find their way back legitimately, not just to have black skin, but to also the blackness of their spirit, the blackness of their soul. Ka, another definition of Ka is blackness. To find the true definition of who they are, to not fall into these potholes. So the purpose of this video, the purpose of this series is to make sure that children and great-grandchildren that are coming by, that they won't have to deal with coloring European mysticism black. See you on the next episode.